Welcome to the revision of core topics element of your ACCA TX revision course for Got It Pass. In this particular section, the largest section in our course, I'm going to take you through a series of videos, a video suite as it were, that cover each of the tax heads within the ACCA TX UK syllabus. We're talking of course about income tax, corporation tax, capital gains tax, inheritance tax, and VAT. And the purpose and objective within this particular video suite is to make sure that you understand where the cheap and easy marks are in each of the main computations. We know from past studies that within the ACCA TX UK exam, the bulk of the marks are for income tax and indeed corporation tax. And we know with the three-way split across the exam, Section A, Section B, and Section C, with the first two being OT-based or short form, and the final section, Section C, being long form, we know that a high proportion of the marks are going to be for income tax and corporation tax. So the basics of those two areas we need to cover in real detail. And you'll see from the breakdown of the 20 plus questions within this particular pack that the emphasis is on income tax and indeed corporation tax. Now that doesn't mean that the other taxes, all three of them, are not important. Of course they are. But the purpose of this particular video suite is to make sure that you have a solid understanding of the first two taxes, income tax and indeed corporation tax. One key point that I've made elsewhere within this course is that passing tax exams, whether or not it's TX, ATX, or in any other professional body, is very much about exam technique first and indeed a modicum of knowledge. And what you'll find across the board as I run through each question and each answer in this particular pack, you'll see that I place a big emphasis on exam technique and indeed scoring those easy or cheap marks. The key to success for me in the ACCA TX exam is to make sure, particularly in Section C, that you get the easy marks. We know that in Section A and in Section B, it's really hit or miss. In other words, you either get the question correct or you don't. And that's why the ACCA TX examiner tends to make the difficulty level just slightly less for the most part in Section A in particular, and also to a lesser extent in Section B, because he knows that getting tax questions perfect is often difficult. Okay, so let's move into the first section. You'll see, as I've mentioned, that this particular pack covers the 5 tax heads and is in a series of video parts. What I encourage you to do, as I said within the course outline and intro, is to take the videos in bite-sized chunks. What I would not advise is to watch several videos and then go to the questions. I would break each video down into parts, let's say 15 to 20 minutes, and then do a question that's relevant to that section. Again, the key to success outside of what I've just said in terms of exam technique and a modicum of knowledge is certainly practice. And in my experience of teaching ACCA TX resit students over the last 12 to 13 years is nearly 100 times out of 100 times, 100% of the time, that where a student comes to me and they are an ACCA TX resitter, is highly unlikely that they have practiced enough. In other words, that they've used the prep period, the preparation period, really to fail in tax questions over and over again, because failing in tax questions is the key to success on the big day. Let's remember that failing in the build-up to the big day isn't important. We can fail all we want. The most important thing is that we learn from the failure. So let's kick off in our first section here. You'll see that the first section concerns income tax questions. I'm going to make the screen just a little bit bigger for you so that you can see everything. And what you'll note is that basically we have the question and indeed the answer. So what I'm going to focus on in one sense is just put myself, I guess, in the position that you're in on the day of the exam And indeed, try to talk through as if I was doing the question in an exam. Yeah. In other words, the approach that I would take, and indeed, how I would perhaps structure from step 1 to step 2 to step 3. Okay. So in this first instance, we're going to look at question number 1, income tax computation basic. Now, for the first few questions in each of the tax heads, I'm going to keep things fairly slow. We will build up in speed, obviously, as we go, but I think it's important that you get a grip on how I'm approaching each question. So I'll take it slowly, yeah, and then we'll speed up as we get to sort of middle and end of each section. So we'll see here from this very first question in the income tax section is that looking at the requirement, okay, we see that the requirement for this particular person, Kate, yeah, is to, in a sense, just simply build an income tax computation for our tax year 2022-2023, okay? Now, what's important here in terms of the requirement are two things. The first thing is you'll note that we always read the requirement first of any question, whether or not it's OT or indeed long form. So whatever sections it's in, section A, B, or C, it's always to the requirement first. Why? Because we know what we're looking for, okay? And very often in the requirement, as it does here, there are one or two things, possibly more, that point us to the area of cheap marks or easy marks. Now, in this particular case, it's an income tax computation, but it does ask us for income tax payable, okay? Income tax payable. Let's remember that an income tax computation is spread into several different parts, and the income tax payable is right at the end. In other words, what they haven't asked for here is income tax liability. Now, you may be up to speed so much that me making this point early on, you've probably heard it before, you think that's very basic. Well, I can tell you from marking mock exams, students very often sometimes, and a reasonably high proportion, tend to make an error here. In other words, rather than providing the income tax payable, they provide the income tax liability. Now, we know that the difference between the two areas is very simply tax credits. In other words, any tax that the individual, in this case, Kate, has paid during the 2022-2023 year. So really, this is marks for very little. So what we'll be looking out for when we review the question in full are any tax credits that are relevant, because certainly if the examiner has asked us for income tax payable, there must be tax credits in the body of the question. Highly likely. Okay, so an income tax payable figure for Kate will involve, obviously, an income tax computation. And indeed, as just mentioned, an income tax computation, it's important for us, I know this is basic, to understand that it's split into several main parts. Obviously, we populate the comp for income. Then we may have some deductions, for example, a personal allowance. And then we come to the section where we apply the relevant tax rates across each of the forms of income. And then outside of that, the very last part would be, as mentioned, the tax credits area. So broadly speaking, we're talking about 4 main areas. And I want you to approach laying out an income tax computation on that basis. Don't try and look at it as one job lot, one whole thing, and I've got to get the whole thing right. No, let's break it down into parts based on the scenario that you're given in the question. Okay, one more time. Firstly, the income, the population of the income tax computation at the top with the income. The second part is really any deductions that may be relevant. The personal allowance is only one. We then obviously come to the income that is basically subject to tax. That's where we apply the relevant rates. I have some advice for you on that third section of an income tax computation as we get into the answer for Kate. And then the final section, or the fourth section, if you will, is really the tax credits, where we deduct anything that Kate has paid during the year to go from income tax liability to income tax payable. Okay, so let's take a look at the information that they've provided us with. We know that they say here up top that she has the following income and indeed outgoings for the year. And as we scan down the information here, you'll see that nothing is either positive or negative in one sense. It's all in the same sign. So we'll take it as being positive. But let's note that there are incomings and indeed outgoings here. Should be fairly easy to spot that, but again, I've seen students make mistake on this area and mistaking income for some payment or the reverse. So as we scroll down the page here, we see trading income, we see employment income, and then we see bank deposit interest. Now note that in brackets they say amount received. I wonder why they say that. Does that mean that there's some form of deduction at source by the paying institution, the bank, the building society, etc., and perhaps this figure needs to be grossed up in some way? Maybe, maybe not. In addition to that, we see dividend income. Again, a reference to amount received. In other words, received into the bank account or perhaps building society account by Kate, our taxpayer. So, some question marks here about whether or not these items are gross or indeed net. Now, we should know that when we populate part 1, the top of our income tax computation, where the amounts relate to income, as they will, we always include them gross. It must always be gross at whatever the relevant percentage is. So, I've got a query so far. I'll deal with that in a moment. The next line down says qualifying interest, amount paid. Now, perhaps I'm not sure what it's for. Qualifying for what? You know, it says interest, so it sounds as if it may well be some sort of qualifying purpose, perhaps. And note also that it's the amount paid. The next area here is gift aid. And again, it refers to an amount paid. 2,000. Now, when we think of gift aid, maybe we're up on this, maybe we're not, but it sounds like Kate has been charitable in some way, shape, or form, and she's paid out an amount, quite a considerable amount, £2,000 sterling. So it may well be that if she's paid that out for some charitable purpose, it may well be that there's some benefit to her for doing that. That's what we need to think of. I'm just wondering, in terms of the benefit that there may be for Kate making quite a substantial charitable donation, I'm wondering what that benefit would be, and indeed how this would impact upon the income tax computation. Okay? So there's the various items of income. It looks like 4, and we have 2 outgoings, as it were, the qualifying interest and indeed gift aid. On the very final sentence, it says PAYE of 505 deducted from employment income. Now, we should know from our past studies that PAYE simply means deductions at source where a person is employed. So what we have to think about is that this element here is the tax cumulatively deducted over the course of time during that tax year. So the bottom line is this: that seems to me to be a tax credit. Now, remember what I said about the computation and the difference between income tax liability and income tax payable, which is what we've been asked for. It seems to me that that has to be relevant. And I can tell you that for the deduction simply of that amount after the IT liability, there will be half a mark given in a long form question. So this is really one reference to what I said earlier on, which is very, very cheap or easy marks. And yet, I've seen in the past a number of times, too many times in fact, where students in the rush, because they're stressed or tired or uptight, they forget to deduct any credits. This is just one type. There are other types. So let's watch out for that. And let's remember, as we get down towards the end of the comp, remember the fourth part, as it were, that we don't forget to deduct the tax credit. So, in summary, there's our setup Now, a quick word about an income tax computation before we come to look at the solution to this. We should know from our past studies that an income tax computation in long form format is really a set of columns. We know that this income here will be split into a number of areas: non-savings, savings, and dividends. So it's our job in the first part of the computation to slot these four items into the correct parts. Now note that if we are approaching an income tax computation or some sort of income tax payable calculation in section A or in section B, I would still be inclined to go the long form route. What I mean by that is some students would find building columns and typing out, obviously, non-savings, savings, and dividends to waste a lot of time. But I found in my studies that sometimes going the longer route gets me more accurate rather than, let's say, doing it in one column, okay? So my suggestion here is that in section A, we simply use NS, S, and indeed D. No pound signs at all. We're working quickly, but still use the three columns. And if you will, or if you want to, also use the fourth column, which is often the total column. In other words, the total of each of the three columns. Now, it's up to you, and to some extent, it depends on your confidence and your level of knowledge. But my advice for most students is to stick to the long form format. It leads to, in the main, less errors. Now, outside of that, in relation to section C, we'll see within this particular part of the course that all of the questions are, or they look like, certainly long form. But no, a question like this could very easily form part of section A or indeed section B. So in various parts of this video series, I'm going to point you in the direction of typical OT or objective style areas that would be examined, and I'll pick them out from the question and indeed pick them out from the answer. So getting back to the format then, we've said three columns, four if you include a total column. And what we're looking to do is to work quickly down the page, obviously towards the end, whether or not that's income tax liability or income tax payable. One key point, particularly in long form questions, question C, is try to be neat. Try to present well, and indeed try to make your answer marker friendly. Why do I say that? Well, several reasons. Number one, marking ACCA TX scripts is very, very hard work. Marking tax papers, I would say generally, is one of the toughest things to do because there's so much to them, so many numbers, they can be quite complex. So getting on side with your marker by presenting well, by structuring well, by making it clear as to what you're doing, you're going to put yourself in a position where if your marker, he or she, needs to give you the benefit of the doubt in some way, they're more inclined to, if you've made an effort in the structure of your answer. If your answers are disorganized, messy, all over the place, difficult to follow, they're less inclined to. This is just human nature. I'm not suggesting that the ACCA TX markers are unprofessional or will get annoyed. It's just simple common sense. Let's present well. We are professional people, yeah, and let's keep our workings, etc., organized.